Okay, good morning, everyone, and welcome to this seminar on international climate cooperation and the future of climate diplomacy. My name is Nagme Nasiritusi, and I'm a researcher at the Swedish Institute of International Affairs and at Uppsala University. And I'm very pleased to moderate this session. This session is co-hosted by the Swedish Institute of International Affairs, Ministry of Geopolitics, and Linköping University. And we have an excellent panel of speakers today. See if it works. Yes. So in this seminar, we will discuss the challenges and opportunities of current international climate cooperation and the potentials for reform of global climate governance. In a few weeks, attention will turn to Dubai, where COP28 will be hosted. We are at a critical moment in international climate cooperation. While we have seen incremental progress on climate action since the Paris Agreement, we know that there are many gaps to be filled in order to achieve the targets in the Paris Agreement. And at the same time, the negotiations will happen at a time of increasing conflict and geopolitical tensions. A pertinent question is therefore, how can international climate cooperation be strengthened to increase ambition and drive implementation? This was a guiding question in a research project that we have conducted. And today we'll present some of the results from this research and also launch a report on the future of the UNFCCC. The plan for the seminar is as follows. First, we will have two presentations outlining research findings that will set the scene for the discussions and also provide an overview of current developments. Then we will have a panel with expertise in global climate governance to discuss these developments and offer their perspectives on the outlooks. And our expert panelists are Mattias Frumeri, Sweden's climate ambassador and head of the delegation to the UNFCCC, based at the Swedish Ministry of Climate and Enterprise. And joining us from Argentina, we have Haley Stevenson, Associate Professor in International Relations at Universidad Torquato di Tella. And we also have with us Richard Klein, Senior Research Fellow at Stockholm Environment Institute. Unfortunately, our fourth panelist had to cancel at short notice, but there will be plenty of time for discussions. And after the panel discussion, we welcome questions from the audience. And if you're joining us online, please type your questions in the Q&A function, and our colleague Jennifer will read them out. So, our first speaker is Gunilla Reichel, Head of Program and Senior Research Fellow of the Global Politics and Security Program at the Swedish Institute of International Affairs. Gunilla will present some findings and conclusions from the research project Connecting the Dots, Climate Clubs, and Negative Emissions. Gunilla, please welcome.
Thank you, Nagme, for the introduction. And I'm also very pleased to be here to discuss those important topics today. And as Nagme said, the presentation is based on a project that we have conducted over the last 4 years, and it's towards the very end now. And it's called Connecting the Dots, Climate Clubs and Negative Emissions. And it's funded by the Swedish Research Council on Sustainable Development. And today I will focus on the theme of climate clubs, which have been one part of the project. And the other participants, apart from Nagme and myself, is Alexandra Bojulova, who is sitting here, and is also at the Swedish Institute of International Affairs. And we have Mattias Fridal in the middle here from Linköping University, and also Indra Överland from the Norwegian Institute of International Affairs, who unfortunately couldn't join us today. So the very broad entry point of this project is that we have an implementation gap, and that is the gap between, or parties to the UNFCCC are today and where they ought to be in order to reach the Paris mitigation objectives. And this is, of course, more important than ever, since we have recent developments, as are very familiar of now, different crises and global shocks like the pandemic, war, living cost crisis, energy crisis, backtracking of states' climate policies, and also that some are actually talking about as a backlash against climate policy in general. So against this very gloomy context, who could drive climate ambition, the necessary increase in ambition today? What are the diplomatic and political solutions for increasing ambition? And we, in this project, we zoom in on climate coalitions, sometimes referred to as climate clubs. And these have featured throughout the history of climate diplomacy. So it's not a new phenomena, but it has sort of gained like an emergency in the debate, I would say, in recent years. The basic idea is that we have a smaller group of states and also other actors, increasingly other actors, that could set more ambitious targets and drive ambition much more forcefully than in the international process of negotiations. Because there's normally the decision-making procedures of international cooperation is the lowest common denominator. Laggard countries tend to set the pace. So in order to sort of achieve a more force and more ambition, these groups have seen as a way of doing that. And we, in the debate, in both in academia, but also in public policy debates, you see increasingly talk about transformational clubs. And this is based on the discussion of the Nordhaus, the definition Nordhaus type of club, which comes from the economic theory. And that kind of club is not nothing. We don't have that today. It's no, but it's it sort of sets quite high barriers to entry, and it's also built on the thought that that are sanction possibilities for members, and that are different benefits for the club members. We see this discussion in it has featured in the recent CBAM, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism of the EU, also in the G7 Climate Club that will, I think, be launched at COP28, and also the EU-US Global Arrangement on Sustainable Steel and Aluminium. And so these are the examples where sort of this climate club discussion ties in. However, it's quite difficult to analyze those because either they are very recently established, or they are non-existent or are about to be established, or there are also some breakdown in talks between the EU and US, for instance. So we don't have them. They are a very moving target, so to speak. So it makes it a bit difficult to sort of do it from an academic perspective. But we have a proliferation of climate coalitions that have sort of featured much more. There are much more of them, and the criteria for these are lower to organize. The entry for members is also lower, so it's an easier form of cooperation. And these coalitions that you see an example of here, they bring together both state actors, but also non-state actors. You could have like city actors, business actors, they set, for example, they set targets like net zero targets and try to raise the ambition in that context, or phase out coal production, or set rules for high emitting industries. And over the past 20 years, we have seen from previous studies that there's a strong upward trend in the number of coalitions. And those are just a few examples. what is interesting here is that there's a certain knowledge gap and some confusion regarding the nature of collisions. And that in turn, it's not only conceptual confusion, it's more something that actually affect the debate on how these collisions contribute to climate governance and climate action. And it's very difficult to assess them in terms of impact and effectiveness. And this is the point of departure for our research. And I will just briefly summarize some of our research findings here. So first, there's a large, of course, because they're very different, there's a large variation in the design of these. There are some, both in size and membership, there are some very small with only a few states that participate, but there are also very broad coalitions that join together both city actors and important business and states. Then also the relationship to UNFCCC tends to vary, and the institutional backing in terms of if they have a secretariat or not is also something that we see differ. There are some, when we have done the studies here, there are legitimacy concerns that come up with the discussion on these coalitions. And mainly for many actors of the global south, there's a deep suspicion about rich and powerful emitters that are taking control over different processes related to coalitions. And related to this is that most of the initiatives to coalitions come from G7 members, and many of them are centered in the global north. So that's also something that has been pointed out. And I would like to share with you some results from, it was the first round of interviews that we did quite early on in the project, where we tried to map out the roles and achievements and limitations of these coalitions. And we have it here in a table. I don't want to read everything out here aloud, but I think of particular interest when it comes to roles. I think what we have found later in the research is that one important part is where they could help to shift the way we frame energy transition problems. And that could imply some sort of normative impact, which is it's more tacit and more difficult to grasp, but it's also a very important function. And then when it comes to achievements, we have seen that these are the things that were highlighted by the respondents that we interviewed, and the respondents were the community of climate in climate diplomacy, quite broad categories from different countries. I think one thing that stands out here is that the possibility to mobilize and to advance certain topics that it's not possible to achieve an outcome in the formal negotiations. So that's also a very important achievement and function, I would say. When it comes to limitation, these are, of course, very vulnerable to change, as has been pointed out. It depends very much on the political context. So it depends, since they don't have this sort of institutional backing normally and are much more loosely organized, they tend to change. It also relates to the second point, where they have to rely on certain key people to keep the momentum going in these coalitions. We have seen some of the coalition that sort of starts with like a big fanfare and then pan out. And another thing that is quite interesting and important, I think I mentioned the difficulty with assessing effectiveness and impact. So that's an important point, but also the crowded space of climate coalitions and initiatives. It makes it easy to sort of see that there might be possibilities or risks of duplications. And also another point is that when new coalitions are created, how do they relate to the existing ones? So some results on that. I think another part is the membership and who participates in these coalitions is also interesting. That relates more broadly, not only membership, but it's also who the target actors are. So who are the actors that are mainly responsible for the problem? and which actors do the coalitions target as part of problem solving. And then that leads also to the who are actually a member of the coalition and what are the incentives to become a member. We have done a quite, it's a bit rough measure as so far, but we have studied 18 coalitions or analyzed 18 coalitions and then just looked into the top 10 emitting countries and how many they were members in. And of course, the impact of this depends very much on the type of coalition, which you can't see here. But I guess we could give an example. If you have a coalition that are aiming to phase out coal, for instance, it could be quite useful to have the big coal producers as part of the coalition. Is one view, and then we talk about veto actors, that we should have them on board. But the other view is that it might also be, they might also be able to stand outside the coalitions, and the other actors that are much more engaged and have sort of stronger incentives to work harder, they might have this normative impact, as I was talking about. So a rough measure, but quite interesting to just give an idea. Some other key insights, more general. It's fair to say that if the need to accelerate decarbonization is an extremely tough challenge, and to make state keep promises remain difficult, and also to raise the ambition. And we can't expect these coalitions to actually have a direct impact on that. But we think and see in the research that there is some kind of normative impact, and they have been able to contribute to normative change in some of the hard to abate sectors, as they are called. I think particularly interesting is the sort of build up of this anti-fossil fuel norm, and see how that sort of trickled down or out. There are also some interesting target agreements which relates to this hard to abate sectors, but measure, as I think I mentioned that, but the measures against fossil fuels, subsidies to phase out coal, set rules for high emitting industries. So here we could see a real contribution of the coalitions, and I think this is something that we are continuing doing research on, and which is also something I think we need to increase the knowledge on that. And then more generally, I think when we talk about climate clubs or unilateral solutions, there's a tendency in the debate to sort of argue that one is better than the other. So it's either multilateralism or unilateralism. But that is that's a false way of viewing it, I think, because we need both. And since the decarbonization issue or process, it's such a big issue, it's large on scale, and we need many different fora that are that sort of complement each other. And here I think it's interesting to raise the role of UNFCCC, but I will not do that because I think Björn-Ola and Alexandra will talk more about that. But how UNFCCC could play a role in sort of relating these parts of this landscape together. And then finally, for the findings, I think it's fair to say that the quite theoretical concept of a climate club, this Nordhaus model, it doesn't exist, as I said, and it's a very high barriers to create this. And I think it's also, it's a bit, it's not very productive if, like in policy debates, if you get sort of stuck in the debate on the Nordhaus climate model instead of looking to other solutions. So this is our research, and we have a few articles that we have published on the theme, some on CBAM, and some were on the conceptualization on climate clubs and others. And if you're interested, you could just talk to us afterwards, and we're happy to share them. So that's all for me. So thank you so much.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Gunilla. So what we've heard is that outside the UNFCCC, there's a whole ecosystem of climate initiatives. But of course, the UNFCCC has been a central actor in climate governance for a long time. It has come under quite heavy criticism for lacking legitimacy and effectiveness at times, and there have been more and more calls for reforms. So our next presenters will launch a report on the future of the UNFCCC. And for that, I welcome up Alexandra Boilova, researcher at the Swedish Institute for International Affairs, and Björn-Ola Linnér, professor at Linköping University and program director of Mistra Geopolitics. Please welcome.
Can just add while we wait. I'm in Geneva at the moment, so we have the acting program director sitting here, Henry Carlson. Very so I'm okay. And you use the mic then? Okay, all right. Okay, yes, thanks. It's great to see you here, and those of you who are online, thanks for joining. We will present this report, which you can take with you home if you're in the room, that we launched today about the future of UNFCCC and the discussions on reform. And this originated, the idea is to make such a report originated last autumn, or sort of it has been perhaps brewing for a while, but last autumn it was clear that there was so much emphasis, so many experts and people involved in the policy process and so on that started to raising the question, is really UNFCCC fit for purpose? Okay, it delivered the Paris Agreement, but when we are entering a implementation phase, when all the details, more and more of the details of the Paris Agreement were in place, did it really deliver the action? So it delivered the agreement, does it deliver the action? This is a quote which we have in the report, which is rather telling. There is a very dark cloud hanging over UNFCCC and the wider multilateral response to the climate crisis, that despite all the agreements, emissions starts rising. And it was interesting with this quote, many who were involved in the discussion on a reform of UNFCCC, but this particular quote comes from 4 senior people in the secretariat, 3 former heads, secretary generals of the UNFCCC, and one that has been deputy for 10 years, so Richard Kinley. The others have been having the helm of the UNFCCC for quite a long time already, since the Kyoto Protocol, which is the first picture there where we have Mikael Samet. Oh, that's something happened with that name. It's hidden somewhere. But yeah, anyway, so that's the starting point where we thought it would be interesting to map all these different ideas on, okay, what are then the ideas for reform? Because we could see that there were quite different ideas on the UNFCCC and how it could progress in the future. And so let's start with the commonalities. I think from the interviews, we could clearly see that there is a strong agreement that UNFCCC is still needed. So that strong support for that, but also equally strong agreement, but it needs to be reformed. That's where we have the common basis. And then there are a lot of ideas, which you will hear more about soon. Just a few words on sort of the starting points for this for the study. So semi-structured interviews with a lot of participants that have been involved in different capacities in the negotiations, and either as diplomats or government actors, but also NGOs and then academics, of course. So about a third each. Drawback with the study so far, we are working to complement this report, is that is a high where not so many from lower middle income countries as we had hoped, but we're working on that. Also the business sector we should try to reach a few more of this if we want to. But still, 30 that have been heavily involved. So it really has given us a great mapping of the different ideas that are out there. And I will just quickly go through some sort of the floor on what the context of where the proposals for reform, where we can see them. And then there are some clear strengths that there are agreement on, that they emphasize the climate convention, clear strengths on that it's a unique legal entity. It's only global legal entity, and that's strength to build on. I think that's why there is still such a huge support for the UNFCCC as in itself, and also the regional stimulus that when the negotiations travel around in the 5 world regions every time, that's regarded as a strength still, because it creates visibility, creates political momentum, so all around the world. And it also captures the global media space. But of course, clearly the delivery deficit is a problem. The negotiations might appear, when there is a lot of hype every year around the negotiations, that there is actually a lot of action going on, much more than it delivers. So it might create the illusion of more action than it actually are there. The lack of transparency, you can have many declarations and so on at the negotiations, but how are they followed up, and how can they be measured, and so on. And a recent example of that is the Methane Alliance that the US and China launched in Glasgow, and seemed very promising. And then for 2 years, nothing happened. And now it's on the table again. So maybe we will see some action there. But it's hard to follow up all these different initiatives that are there. And the lack of cooperation in innovation, there has been often the same people involved in the negotiations and so on. So there is not some, the conflict seems to get stuck, or it's the same way to approach the issues, but also that smaller actors, some countries that are not so resourceful, or NGOs and so on, they have a harder time to engage. So these were sort of common pictures of the pros and cons. But then we have some, what we call, or now called, not in the report, but Janus phases of the UNFCCC process. Janus is often used as a metaphor for two perspectives. But he is also the god of new beginnings, transitions, gatekeeper, so turns on the heavenly light or switches it off. So maybe there is more to this metaphor than this. Only the strengths and weaknesses. We can come back to that. But there are 4 issues where we saw some clear divisions on how the respondents view this. Well, the same respondents can actually both see things as strengths and weaknesses. The consensus principle and the global participation is such. So it enhances legitimacy and equality among partners, that there is a consensus, everybody have to be on board and so on. So that is, some argue that this is very important. Others point at the that it slows and waters down the decision making. Seeking the least common denominator, that's really a problem, because some actors can use this to obstruct the process. The negotiations always goes into overtime and so on. I think in this case, maybe, and Alexander can correct me, but in this case, many held the same views, that you could both see both sides of this principle. So this is kind of a tricky issue. It comes with clear benefits and drawbacks in itself. Other issues is that the COPs have become more comprehensive. So the expanding agenda over the years, that's seen as strength in that it is more comprehensive, where the actors can link issues clearly, not only in a tit-for-tat bargaining, but also see how they are connected and where the linkages can be made. And it also enhances learning and understanding of perspectives from all over the world. So in that sense, that has brought wider understanding for the different context of those who negotiate and their agendas. But it risks also then to lack precision. It overloads the process. So these are 2 drawbacks. clearly. Related to that is also the meeting place, which has a growing number of participants, which displays an interest. Sort of, it will be record in COP28. So in a way, it shows that it's really super interesting to go to, and it's does place a meaning. You vote with your feet. You go where you think it is important to be. And it's also then a prominent space for international politics, that it is so much hype, so many go there, so many ministries and so are involved in the negotiation, shows that this is a key space for international politics, which helps to raise the issue, and that also draws media attention. The drawbacks of that is that the large numbers can be a distraction. Those who think that the growing meeting place that distracts from the negotiations. There's so many issues that are covered. There's so many NGOs and so on that are involved that are not really then there for the specific agenda items that are negotiated, but more involved in a broader climate discussion and so on. So some then use the word like festival, circus, and so on. So there is a disconnect between sort of the whole climate fair that the negotiations can be with the actual negotiations. And that sort of stretches the negotiations thin, that there is, to quote Bilbo, I feel thin, sort of stretched like butter scraped over too much bread, which we all perhaps can feel sometimes, but maybe this is also a metaphor for that critique of the negotiations. Then we have finally the convening power of the COPs, where the in-person meetings where people come for the negotiations that can provide a platform for building trust and building relationships and so on. The political leaders' presence that signals a whole government approach, that it should permit all government activities and so on. And it also allows then since there is so much focus on the political leaders and so on, that you can name and shame. And it's maybe that's why some have stopped going there. I don't know. But logistically, it is very difficult to organize, and you can only have sort of rich and powerful actors that really can do this well. Or you can Egypt, who didn't do it that well. And the rotating presidency also favors resource countries and their agendas, because the host countries can set the self-promote or set the agenda, and that is seen as a drawback. That was a long scene setting.
Is the mic working? Yeah. Okay.
Should you? No?
This is okay. Yeah. Thank you, Björn Ola. And I will continue with the presentation of the results. And before moving to the discussion of the reform proposals, I will first present the perceptions of interviewees on the roles and functions of the UNFCCC. So generally, we saw an agreement that we are moving to the implementation stage of the Paris Agreement. Then the question is, what is the role of the UNFCCC today and in that new context? So there was a consensus among the respondents that the UNFCCC plays the role of agenda setting, momentum building, and policy signals, and being a high-level political forum. And we also seen that the negotiating function is still central, that it's important to continue negotiations because there are still issues that's on the table, like adaptation, finance, loss and damage, for phasing out of fossil fuels that needs to be negotiating. But there were a few respondents that emphasized that it's not a strength of a multilateral process to achieve implementation, and therefore we need better manage expectations of what the process can actually achieve. However, the majority of the respondents still emphasize that the UNFCCC and COPs in particular have a potential to facilitate implementation moving into the future, and it can do so via a few different functions and ways. One is via its convening powers and mobilization of different actors and resources, and also having a broader outreach to the public as well. A second way is giving direction to the broader landscape of climate governance institutions, what Gunilla mentioned earlier in her presentation, and better coordinated landscape and negotiating what different functions the institutions should play. Then also giving spotlight to different climate initiatives and connected to that the functions of tracking and oversight of pledges and actions. So moving on to the proposals for reform. So we ask our interviewees which, if any, reforms are needed, because there were a few that, again, to emphasize, they said that it's more about managing expectations rather than reforming the process. However, the majority agreed that there needs to be changes to the process. So the first, and we grouped the reform proposals into 4 broad categories, and I'll go over them, but there is certainly overlap between some of them. So the first category concerns participation and representation. So here we find demands for better management of the size of COPs related to the admittance of the participants, and some suggestions include adoption of conflict of interest policy to prevent the free flow of fossil fuel and commercial interests. Others propose even greater separation between negotiation zone and the side events zone, even proposing having 2 separate events, although that was not the most popular idea. And so many are not in favor of separation because they are worried that restricting participation and further separating participants from each other will actually risk excluding certain voices and prevent mobilization of actors that actually need to do implementation and making negotiations too technocratic and inward looking. So on the other hand, there were a few who were not concerned about growing size of COPs and not concerned about the types of participants, saying that these conversations would take place in other places regardless. But at COPs, at least we can have a certain oversight of these conversations. But among many, there was a general sense that there needs to be some kind of consideration who is represented, and more assistance needs to be given to those who need to attend COPs but are not able to. More attendance by a diverse group of national level ministers is needed beyond the foreign policy and environmental departments. And finally, there was also conversation and call for improving the quality of interactions between negotiators and observers and NGOs. And a few examples given include relying on high-level champions and Marrakesh partnership, using global stocktake process more, and using world cafes forums, and as well as learning from other negotiation platforms how to organize the conversations. The second category of reform types concerns transparency and accountability. That was a big topic for discussion. And the one key message here, emphasized here, includes the need for the UNFCCC to develop its own methodologies for tracking and reporting on state and non-state action. Even though there was a conversation about that we can rely on tracking by institutions outside of the UNFCCC, but the reason to have an internal mechanism includes that then it's less likely to be dismissed by different parties on the grounds of not being legitimate. So having in-house capacity was emphasized. And then connected to this, the call for more transparent communication of national pledges and actions. And here emphasis is made on a bigger role for global stocktake and enhanced transparency framework, perhaps to take place more frequently and being at the forefront of the UNFCCC process. Okay, moving on to the third type, and it concerns organization and planning of COPs and organization and coordination of the different processes within the institution. An example given here includes streamlining COP's agendas. That's a very common one, and you probably have heard that many times as well. And another examples include merging COP and CMA processes and better coordinating between and using expertise of constituted bodies. Related to these are proposals to improve selection of COP presidencies to have a better representation of different countries who can host COPs, but balancing the challenge that it takes a lot of capacity to host these meetings, and some propose a system of co-hosting, or not very popular idea, but also having COPs in the permanent location, for example, Bonn, but that was mentioned only by a few. Another proposal relates to bringing sectoral discussions into the negotiations. And on this one, I think the respondents split in about two groups. For one group, that being a way to address implementation. But for others, such development represents an obstacle because it can create overcrowded agenda even further and therefore slow down the process. So they propose to keep the sectoral discussions outside of the UNFCCC negotiations. And finally, some express the need for the UNFCCC to better address capacity building, and not only for national level action, but also for negotiators themselves to be able to navigate the growing complexity of the process. And finally, many respondents place a big emphasis on the role of the UNFCCC in navigating and coordinating the ecosystem of climate governance institutions, and highlighting that we should be looking at climate action through the lens of collaboration between these different institutions and negotiating the roles between them and dividing responsibilities. So here we ask respondents to reflect on what role UNFCCC can play in regions. And here we find that there is no really appetite for the UNFCCC regional presence because there are already other UN offices there, and we should not create a redundancy. Instead, there were suggestions that we should build capacity of other UN offices to address climate questions, and then more emphasis should be placed on already existing regional climate weeks, and then perhaps UNFCCC Secretariat could play a bigger role and bigger presence in those events. Then attention was also brought to the financial mechanisms of the convention, Bretton Woods institutions, and other development banks. Some call for financial institutions to be mobilized better or be reformed to push financial flows into climate action much more, as well as to be better connected to the UNFCCC. And in relation to this, many respondents support multilateralism. They believe that the UNFCCC is important, and that many conversations that happens in other forums, other institutions, should end up in the UNFCCC. But of course, the other coalitions, the front-runner alliances, the climate clubs, coalitions of the willing were mentioned as complementary, and examples of G7, G20 being important forums to push for ambition, for instance, because it's difficult to do so in the negotiation process that mentioned. But again, some of them face critiques for lacking transparency and also lack of needed action. And therefore, again, that the UNFCCC could be the connecting point for these institutions, and that the conversations should end up there. That's been the general view. And finally, there was almost no demand for explicit new institutions to be established to accelerate the implementation. One respondent highlighted a need to have UN Security Council type of arrangement, but for climate issues. And then one respondent emphasized that more attention should be paid to alternative spaces to meet and discuss outside of the UNFCCC forums, especially for more independent civil society networks. And then moving on to the last slide on the results presentation, so to speak. So what are the prospects for implementing some of these reforms that were mentioned? So the general conclusion that we draw from the interviews is that the prospects for change that are initiated within the formal UNFCCC negotiation process are limited due to some of the factors that Bjørnøla highlighted, but it's not impossible. We find that it's not impossible to implement that, but that depends on the initiative and leadership of many actors within the process, as well as on the leadership of the Secretary General and Presidency. Interviewees highlight that they can move things forward even without the consensus, and they can have influence on the process inside and outside of the UNFCCC as well. And then the prospects for reform definitely depends on the types of reforms, whether they're more incremental or they're more represent more radical change. However, for example, some of the seemingly procedural reform proposals can also get stuck, and therefore the prospect for their implementation very much depends on trust among the actors in the process. And finally, some respondents argue that conversations about reforms, especially if it concerns reforms that represent a departure from business as usual, need to start outside of the UNFCCC process and then possibly trickle back in later and then get traction that way. So then I will pass the baton back to Bjørnøla.
Yes, just to then wrap up where we think there is a viable path forward. Back to Janus, he's also the god that you have two faces, one looks back and one looks forward. So now we're looking forward. What can be done here? And as Alexander said, there are some issues that there seems to be less controversial, that it has been easier to at least address. So as we said, that there is a consensus that things need to change, but not how they should change. But these three issues, that seems to be a way forward. So we thought that let's start with the low-hanging fruits to start a process within the UNFCCC to discuss reform, and that they could focus down on the issues where there seems to be less controversy. Streamlining the agendas. Of course, we have a lot of agendas at these negotiations. It could be rather confusing even for people who've been in the process for quite a long time. So that could be one thing that could be addressed, and there seems to be coming ground to address that. Also address the internal organizations within the different bodies and programs of the UNFCCC, and then also to better organize the process of accountability, monitoring and tracking the climate actions. So we suggest that to initiate a broader systematic consultation of reform within UNFCCC based on these issues. Then outside, that could be the start of a formal process. Then there is all these issues that Alexandra pointed out, and some of them are really that marked by red here, that we see that there is a lot of potential controversy. So that would be very hard to begin in the formal UNFCCC process. But outside, among academics, in newspapers and so on, we could have a discussion perhaps and continue with the discussion on that, but that should be outside. So that is our recommendations in the report that you please bring home. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that very comprehensive overview of the report, and I hope you take the report home and study it. So now I would like to invite our excellent panel to share their perspectives on what we have just heard. So for that, please welcome Matthias Remery and Richard Klein, and let's see if we can find Haley on Zoom as well.
I've got one here. It's already on.
Perfect. Good morning, Haley. I understand you've woken up very early today. Thank you for joining us.
Good morning. No, it's a real pleasure to be here. Thanks for the invitation.
Great, thanks. So I would like to start by asking you, Matthias, about your reflections on what you have just heard. So we heard many issues about what's happening inside the UNFCCC, but also outside in these different coalitions and initiatives. So in your view, what is going right and what is going wrong in international climate cooperation today?
How much time do we have? Well, first of all, good morning, and thanks for the opportunity to join you here. I must say that these two reports are really favorite topics, both in terms of all the various initiatives we're seeing outside the negotiations and also how we can reform the negotiation process itself. But unfortunately, I think there's within the work that we're doing, and also together with EU colleagues and within the process at large, we're spending too little time to actually discuss these. And it's so therefore I'm very happy to see that these reports are being made, and hopefully we can make the best of the kind of conclusions which they have been putting forward. We did actually organize during the Swedish presidency of the EU during the past 6 months a seminar in Copenhagen on this, where we invited basically all of the parties of the process to sort of discuss these issues on reform and how we sort of, it's like streamlining the agendas, for example, which was part of the conclusions here. And it was quite clear that there's no interest to sort of to go further on these issues because of the various types of vested interest within the process, and that any kind of reform would sort of change the dynamics in a way which, where then certain parties have certain concerns which would then sort of alter those kind of power dynamics, which in a way which probably would mean less power. I think, just picking up on Björn Olaf's points in terms of the low-hanging fruits, there are no low-hanging fruits, basically. Maybe, though, there are, some of the issues which you sort of highlighted in red, those could actually be maybe more open to having that kind of, for some kind of change. In a way, even though, I realize it's not very sort of, might be not seen as very democratic, but the number of participants is, I would say, sort of a result of the kind of venue that the presidency offers. Now when we're going to Dubai, we're going to a huge venue. So, there will be lots of space. Next year, we don't know yet where we're going. We might be going to a smaller place, which, we will then need to be lesser participants. So in a way, that could sort of solve itself in a way. But of course, then a question arises, are there the right kind of participants coming then? Is it the kind of people that we want to be there who are actually then coming? So, there's personally, I see that sort of the number of participants itself doesn't have to be a problem, but rather, we're seeing that as a reflection of the great interest in the process itself. And especially from our side, when we're seeing the increase in business interest to be there, which sort of supports the kind of approach that we want to take to climate action, highlighting the opportunities that we see, how climate action and the transition contributes to jobs and growth, for example. The number of Swedish participants increasing is an example of that. So, there are, I would personally hope that many of the recommendations which have been put forward in these two reports is something which we could work on. But I think the difficulties is in reforming the process as such are very apparent. And that is also one of the reasons why we are increasingly engaging in all these various initiatives outside the negotiations, because we see them as an opportunity to also sort of to highlight progress which is being made. We are members of some 70 international climate initiatives. Everything's sort of from a declaration we signed at some point to these larger initiatives, such as the Leadership Group for Industries Transition, which we started ourselves together with India, which are making progress. And the Glasgow Breakthroughs, for example, which were launched also at COP26. We're seeing now another 10 to 15 initiatives being launched by the UAE presidency to be presented at COP28. So there is it is resource intense for us, definitely. But we also see these initiatives as an opportunity to sort of bring together actors who want to make progress and want to showcase that kind of progress, and using the COPs as an opportunity to sort of to make that progress being more widely known and attract more people into those kind of processes. Well, of course, we need to sort of maintain the work within the negotiations themselves, but we're seeing those two tracks as being more and more sort of complementing each other, I would say.
Excellent, thank you. We'll get back to your views on the current negotiations in a bit. but I would like to turn to Haley now. So you, a couple of years ago, wrote this interesting piece. I think the title was Reforming the UNFCCC in the Age of Bullshit. And I was wondering if you could share your perspectives on what you've heard and where we stand today.
Sure, absolutely. Pleasure. Just a quick logistical clarification. I have comments on various aspects of the report and the general conversation. Shall I share all of those now, or are we going to do a round of?
It depends how long it would take, but sort of we'll get back to the broader issues on the global climate ecosystem around the UNFCCC in a minute. So if you focus on the UNFCCC.
Okay, great. I'll hold those comments for about climate clubs, etc. for next. So firstly, I think I really welcome this conversation, the conversation about what we expect from the UNFCCC is so crucial, and in some ways it's so frustrating to be reading many of the reports that are coming out of the UNFCCC, and I was reading the GST, the Global Stocktake Technical Synthesis Report, and it just feels like deja vu. Like, honestly, it was so, we'll speak a bit more about that later, but it was just so predictable. So much of the language that is there could easily have been written 20 years ago. And this is no criticism of the research team. I think your report is great. But reading the report that you're presenting today, most of that also could have been, said 20 years ago. And that's not a reflection on you as researchers. It's a reflection on, what the stakeholders are saying. And what the stakeholders are saying are the problems and the strengths are exactly what they would have heard or what they would have said 10, 20 years ago. So on the question of the participants, I remember standing in line at the Copenhagen COP. And we were standing in line in freezing temperatures for 4 hours because there were so many people. And that kind of that triggered a discussion about, well, why are there so many non-state actors coming? Why and what should they be? What can they hope to achieve? And do we need to reduce numbers, etc.? And I feel like we still haven't really gotten much further in that conversation in the more than 10 years that have passed since that time. I was reading a review, a review for a Netflix series recently, and it struck me as such a perfectly apt way of describing the COP process. So it said, another week rolls around, another Netflix thriller hits our screens. The story is predictable, bland, and riddled with flashbacks that take an age to get to the point. I think if we replace week with year and Netflix thriller with UNFCCC COP, well, you get the picture. It really captures this kind of the story of the hand-wringing leaders and the negotiators promising and then under-delivering. It's a trope that we're so tired. We must be so tired of hearing this. It feels like we're kind of loyal fans of this series that we really liked at the beginning, and we're each kind of subsequent what's it called, like the chapter, the next season of the series kind of leaves us frustrated and underwhelmed, but we're kind of these loyal fans that we keep kind of gripping onto it. And I think it's so urgent now to think about, well, what do we need to be, what can we expect from the UNFCCC? And we're talking about the implementation phase. I mean, we should have been in the implementation phase for so long now. And the UNFCCC has such a limited capacity to influence that phase. And I think that one of the perhaps the key problem that I see is that what we need from the UNFCCC, from a kind of a technical perspective of what's necessary to secure a stable climate, the reforms that we need from that perspective are politically unfeasible. And the reforms that are politically feasible are not going to be necessary to ensure the stable climate, to put it simply. And I'm really not sure how we overcome that, but I do think that's why I kind of welcome these discussions about, well, realizing that what's technically possible or what's technically necessary and urgent is not politically possible, you know, what do we expect from the UNFCCC in the coming years? I think yeah, I think I'll leave it there, and then I've got some more specific comments to come.
Great, thanks a lot, Haley. So a sense of deja vu. Richard, you've been a part of the process for a long time. What are your perspectives on this?
Yeah, thanks a lot, and thanks also for inviting me to speak. I think it's a really important report, and even though it could have been written 20 years ago, I think it's still timely. The question that you asked at the beginning is, you know, is it time for reform given where we are now? And my answer would be absolutely yes. But the question is, what kind of reform? Are we talking about reform of the international climate governance system at large, or are we talking about reform of the UNFCCC process? And I noticed that Matthias was sort of talking about both, and perhaps you can't really separate the two of them because, you know, the various initiatives that you mentioned, they contribute to the UNFC process in one way or another, and vice versa. But it does create an incredibly unwieldy, fragmented, and most of all, large, and I would say very inefficient way of negotiating an issue that, in all its complexity, is relatively straightforward. We need to get temperatures down. We need to support developing countries in doing so and in preparing for the effects of climate change. I'm going to talk a little bit about a project that Matthias asked us to do 3 years ago when we were in the midst of COVID, and COP26 was postponed because of COVID. And the initial question was, could online technology play a role in the climate negotiations? Could it, in a way, substitute, you know, getting what was then, I think, 30,000 people to Glasgow? But that question over time changed more towards, you know, not like a yes or no question, but, you know, how could technology make the climate negotiations more effective, more transparent, and more inclusive? The part of that project was a large stakeholder engagement. We talked with lots of negotiators and other experts, also civil society. And by and large, people felt like, yes, there is a role for technology, and a quite a positive role. And of course, we also saw that as COVID continued, quite a few events, committee meetings, pre-meetings, regional coordination meetings all took place online, and that worked relatively well. Then we saw a lull in COVID, and just in that lull, Glasgow happened. So COP26, 1 year postponed, did take place in person. We knew that there was a Delta variant on its way. If the Delta variant had been 2 weeks faster, I doubt that that COP26 had taken place in Glasgow, and maybe many more people would have read our report. It's how it is. But I guess what we found in talking to so many different stakeholders was there is the positive take on sort of more online engagement was that it would level the playing field for many. The negative for some negotiators was it would level the playing field. In other words, for some, the argument was really better the devil you know than the devil you don't know. And given the sort of institutional intergovernmental arrangements of the UNFCCC process, it is incredibly difficult to change things. And Matthias and I have talked about that. Could something be done through the agenda item on intergovernmental arrangements? Could, you know, the presidency and the COP Bureau play a role in suggesting perhaps more use of online technology? When we started, we thought the real problem was going to be, you know, there's very poor connectivity in Africa, for example. That did not seem to be an issue at all. Africa is really catching up. And in those countries where people do not have good connectivity at home, they often went to a hotel, and the UNFCCC Secretariat was able to cover the costs for that. Often, you know, some European countries, Germany in particular, faced much greater greater challenges when it comes to connectivity than Africans. So there are a number of bottlenecks, and we are sort of locked in. And I think that's also what Haley was referring to. We are locked into a process that is incredibly difficult to change. Also because the rules of procedure that would allow, in principle, for a vote on these kind of things have never been agreed, and therefore everything needs to be decided by consensus. And if the group of like-minded countries insists on meeting in person whenever it's possible, then we will continue to meet in person. I want to talk about one other aspect that I think really matters in this process, because things are becoming bigger and really, and every COP we get additional agenda items and more committees and more work programs and more frameworks and more meetings. Basically, they all need to be supported by the climate change secretariats, and they all come with additional meetings. At the same time, every 2 years, the subsidiary body for implementation talks about the budget, the biannual budget of the UNFCCC, and increasingly countries are the same countries that want these additional committees and initiatives and frameworks to happen and to meet are saying, well, no, we can't really give more money to the UNFCCC secretariats, even though that's where the money comes from, to organize all these meetings and to allow people from developing countries, for example, to travel. What we saw when Trump was elected, that the US actually halted its contribution altogether, and Mike Bloomberg had to step in to cover the costs that the US would normally have paid. So I think there is, it's a locked-in system, but it's really also very brittle. It could, if through economic crises or because of if the political wind blows from a different way, it could, through the budget, basically halt the process altogether. And I really wonder if that's what we want. My take is that we should not, through either budgetary measures or others, get rid of the process that we have. We should reform the process. The Paris Agreement, I think, is the best game in town, and we should not throw the baby out with the bathwater. But, and that's where I'm coming from, not that I was there, but does any of you know which intergovernmental meeting took place in Nairobi from the 23rd to the 27th of October? No, thought so. 35th meeting of the parties to the Montreal Protocol on substances that deplete the ozone layer. Remember, the ozone layer was a big thing, right? It was a really big thing because it was successful. It was agreed. The protocol still exists. We are still meeting I don't know if it's every year or every 2 years. And it was about 600 people that met in Kenya, in Nairobi, about 2 weeks ago. According to the IISD, it was a very successful meeting. They agreed on addressing substances that deplete the ozone layer as well as lead to climate warming. There was a record replenishment of the international fund, 600 people. My call in terms of a reform is make the UNFCCC COP boring again. Let's get rid of these 75,000 people going to Dubai. We've said for a long time, yes, we have the negotiators. I mean, how many negotiators will there be of those 75,000 people? It will be less than 1%, right? And the rest of it, when we were having our discussions in 2020, maybe we can separate it. I mean, the same question that you addressed. There's a New York Climate Week, there's a London Climate Week, there are the regional climate weeks that the UNFCCC organizes, and we have all those. And I was at the regional climate week in Riyadh a month ago, 5,000 people. And then on top of that, we have all of that in the COP as well. And it creates an enormous hype, it creates enormous expectations. And what was interesting, I just want to add, I'll just leave that for a later question, otherwise I'm talking for too long. But yes, so make the COP boring again, and hopefully we'll see the same kind of progress that we have seen for the Montreal Protocol as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Richard. So maybe back to Matthias then, because you seemed optimistic that there are more and more participants, that it shows the attraction of this issue and that more want to be engaged. So a response to Richard on make the COPs boring again, what do you see as the risks of that?
No, I mean, I think it's a perfectly sound approach. And I mean, if that actually helps us get better results, definitely. And as Richard said, there are multiple occasions for when we can showcase that kind of engagement, which we see at COPs. And it might even be beneficial, to have a number of events throughout the year instead of sort of this one single big event. Obviously there are others, as you mentioned already. My concern, though, would be that, as always with multilateralism, its effect is as much participating countries want to put into it. And I'm not sure that would change, whether we would have a more boring COP or not. It might actually help to have the hype with the current COPs as they are, to put more pressure on countries to actually come to some kind of agreements. If we would have a more boring COP, the pressure might not be there. But then again, it might be. So, I think it's difficult to say. And I think just another aspect which is part of our conversation, at least in terms of reform, is that we have so little time. And a reform itself takes a lot of time, especially when we're reforming this kind of process. So I think that's sort of also part of why we are maybe a bit cautious in terms of how much energy we spend on reform, both in terms of the size of the meetings, how much we can expect from streamlining agendas and so forth. In a way, I guess we could be accused of saying, we're staggering along here just because, we need to make the process work. So we don't see that there is that kind of scope for these kind of overarching reforms, which are needed. But, given that we have to cut emissions in half by 2030, we're nowhere near that. And how do we best use our time in these, remaining 7 years and then onwards as well, to make sure that we can actually deliver the kind of results that we need? And I think part of our reasoning is that, again, it comes back to what every single country is prepared to do. And maybe sort of working in multiple ways, using the COPs as one opportunity, but also then engaging with countries bilaterally and building on sort of what is each country prepared to do. And we're seeing that also sort of within the EU, that we're working more and more bilaterally, I think, with individual countries, not least when it comes to large emitters, to see how can we be joining forces, like, for example, in the just energy transition partnerships as one example, sort of to be more focused in terms of engaging with individual countries. So I guess sort of the answer is, at least currently, let all these flowers bloom, and let's make the best of every kind of opportunity we get to ensure that we're delivering on those.
Great, thank you. So we're hearing from all of you, I think, the importance of domestic politics and political feasibility. So I would turn to you now, Haley. You got an election coming up in Argentina. It's very contested. So how do you see this more sort of increasing geopolitics and domestic politics in flux in different countries? What kind of effect will that have on climate politics and the UNFCCC in particular?
Okay, I mean, that's a really good point. And the context of Argentina, well, every context has its nuances and particularities, but I think there are some common themes. And rather than talking at this precise moment about the geopolitical aspects, I'd like to just make some comments to link thinking about the domestic, what we need more focus at the domestic level, trying to link that with some of the conversation we've already been having about the role of non-state actors, civil society, and the importance of accountability. I think given that, we're in this implementation phase, what we really need from I don't know whether it's from the UNFCCC or something else, but we need mechanisms that provide critical scrutiny of what's being done, critical scrutiny that analyzes the gap between what is being said and what is then being planned in policy, and then what is actually being done. Because just for 3 decades, we've seen this decoupling of rhetoric and policy and practice. So in terms of accountability, we need mechanisms that are that provide critical scrutiny. Now, we know that the mechanisms designed within the UNFCCC, the global stocktake and the enhanced transparency framework, they're designed not to provide critical scrutiny. They're designed in terms of political feasibility, and states really don't want much critical scrutiny of what they're doing. And so the enhanced transparency framework has a very, very technical focus and tries to avoid kind of subjective judgments about the quality of what states are promising in their NDCs. And when the GST, the global stocktake, is then focused on the collective level that avoids kind of naming and shaming particular countries. So those two mechanisms are designed, they're accountability mechanisms that are actually designed to avoid critical scrutiny. And I think there's a major paradox, and it's a major problem. And I think this is where we really need this is where we maybe should be encouraging civil society to channel their energies. So perhaps, yeah, we do need to make COP more boring, but how can we make other moments more exciting? Other moments where civil society does kind of expose this gap between what is being said and what is being done. So there's been this interesting exercise in the IGST, the Independent Global Stocktake, which has tried to build this network, an international network with civil society actors in each country, kind of doing their own assessment. And I think that's a wonderful idea. I imagine it's had some success in some places, but I know in the Latin American context, it has really struggled because simply there's a lack of capacity. Civil society actors depend on voluntary labor. They don't have financing. So what they can do is really, really limited. So when we're thinking about capacity building and the role of non-state actors, civil society actors in particular, critical civil society actors, somehow we need to be thinking about how we can build their capacity to critically scrutinize what is happening in their own country. Now, this brings me to the point that you made, Nagme, about the Argentina, and I think this reflects a lot of other contexts. Accountability is based on the idea that the audience cares about what is being explained or justified, and opinion polling across the world shows that people do care. So there should be an interest in what in this kind of decoupling of rhetoric and action. And Latin America is shown to be the region where levels of concern are highest in the world. But it's also a region, and Argentina is a country that is suffering from so many other urgent issues. And frankly, in Argentina at the moment, it feels absurd to talk about kind of a climate change ambitions. We have inflation of 150%. 40% of the population is in poverty. About 30 years ago, it was 7%. And so poverty is growing. Inflation is, I mean, people are seriously concerned about, they show if you ask them in opinion polls, they're concerned, but whether that concern is then, can translate into, accepting the costs and the effort involved in reaching targets and increasing the ambition of targets, I just don't think that kind of that acceptance is there. Not in Argentina, and I would suggest that that's the case in many other countries. I mean, we're seeing climate backlash, including in the global in Europe. And I mean, from the perspective of the global South, it feels I didn't even know how to describe what it feels, but to see countries that are privileged and wealthy and have the capacity to make changes, and to see that climate backlash because energy costs are rising. Well, these are the things that we've been suffering with in the global South for so many years. And so if there's climate backlash in the global North, then it makes it really hard to persuade countries in the global South that they really should be making an extra effort as well.
Very important points. Thanks for that. And Richard, you wanted to comment on it.
Yeah, I just wanted to pick up on the role of civil society. Fully agree with Hayley, and we talked to civil society as part of our report 2 years ago. And it was really interesting to see how part of civil society felt that basically the bigger the COP, the better, because that gives us more opportunity to put pressure on the negotiations, And there should be opportunities for all of civil society to be there and no restraints. But others were saying, no, we should practice what we preach, and we should really try and keep those COPs as small as possible and not go and fly there. And it was, and yeah, I mean, I think that's interesting. That civil society also, of course, is quite diverse. Also, different views from civil society organizations in the global north and those in the global south. I mean, our report was not to decide what should or shouldn't be done, but it's interesting that these different perspectives do exist, and that I think a strong voice came out of those that argued that these COPs are indeed too big and we shouldn't go there, is to move more towards action at the domestic level. And maybe that's also, I guess that's also the background of where I say, let's make the COPs boring again. I mean, we've been hearing and saying that, with the Paris Agreement and the acceptance of the Paris Rule Book, we've entered a new stage. Much of it was about agreeing and negotiating a global treaty, which is there now. We now have the Paris Rule Book as well. And we're basically now in a 5-yearly process of setting our ambition, implementation, and then tracking that progress with a global stocktake, and then ramping up that ambition and go on. And, in principle, that is a relatively straightforward and, dare I say, should be a relatively boring process. But it isn't for a number of reasons. A, because we're not particularly good at reducing emissions to start with. B, because there are all sorts of challenges with finance. And C, because we keep making up all sorts of new frameworks and committees and work programs that may or may not be relevant. I mean, for example, the cover decision in Sharm el-Sheikh included the establishment of a work program on just transition pathways. Now, I'm not at all suggesting that just transition pathways aren't important, but it sort of came out of the blue. It's there now, it's meeting, and it's, yet another agenda item. And there seems to be perhaps even a reluctance, perhaps even a fear to really enter into those 5-yearly cycles and just focus on the domestic implementation. And I think that civil society can play a really important role in holding individual countries and governments of countries to account, perhaps more effectively than being part of a 75,000 people circus in Dubai. But yeah, more to say about that, but I'll leave it at that.
Interesting perspectives, but we've focused a lot on the UNFCCC, and now I would like to discuss more about Gunilla's presentation on what's happening in the wider landscape. And we're seeing examples that you brought up about CBAM and the US-EU bilateral talks, bringing in more trade and industrial policies as tools to promote climate action. And I would like to ask you, Matthias, what do you see as the opportunities and risks of doing this for climate diplomacy? Do you think it could have a spurring effect on climate action?
Indeed, and I think it has already. I mean, we're seeing, for example, these various initiatives that we've joined. I mean, there are more and more countries joining, and we're also seeing how these various types of initiatives are now working more closely together. For example, on fossil fuel phase out, where we have sort of what we at least call there are sort of value chains between these various types of initiatives. You could sort of, some working within the energy sector. We have sort of the Powering Past Coal Alliance. We have the Friends of Fossil Fuel Subsidy Reform. We have the Beyond Oil and Gas Alliance, and we have the Energy Transition Council, which sort of form elements, so to speak, along some kind of value chain in terms of decarbonization. So I mean, there is definitely momentum for these, and I mean, as I said previously, that we see these as a very, acting in sort of in a complementary fashion to what we can actually achieve within the process itself, and also gives us an opportunity to highlight, what we see as the opportunities in taking this kind of action. But then again, they are resource intensive. So, we're just a small team in the Swedish ministry, and so it's sort of a constant juggle in terms of, you know, do we focus more on these initiatives or do we focus more on the negotiations themselves? So, and I think even if we would have, you know, if we would have more staff, we would, you know, you'd always end up in that kind of conversation, because you'd be, you know, the more staff itself doesn't sort of solve the issue always. I mean, that's I think most of you would know. So I think, but in general, yes, they are a good addition to the work that we're seeing, and I think I would hope that they can spur action in more countries and from more actors. But again, I think the sort of the main stumbling block we have when it comes to climate action more generally is, you know, what are countries prepared to do? And if we're having countries which are saying no, you know, we're seeing there's a growing demand for fossil fuels, they will continue to, you know, to make use of whatever kind of resources they have. If we see that countries have limited capacity in terms of their institutions, their sort of regulatory frameworks, they will say, no, we have barriers here. We can't do X, Y, Z because, you know, we need this kind of capacity building before we can enhance our action. So there are different types of both vested interests and legitimate concerns, which I would say hinder more ambitious action from individual countries. But that also, coming back then to these various initiatives and how we try to approach it, is, you know, how can we both as a country and also within the EU be supporting countries in building capacity and sort of creating these more forward-looking institutional frameworks, and also overcome the barriers where we're saying, well, there are alternatives. You know, how do you know, speaking very openly, I think we have an interest from a Swedish and EU perspective to work with Saudi Arabia to build their new economy. You know, what will their economy look like 2050? They have their vision 2050. They have sort of their national goal of having 50% of their energy mix being renewable by 2030. So how can we be working with them on that and make them a partner in this transition? And not sort of seeing ourselves only as adversaries, which we sometimes are within the negotiations and such. But there is a clear interest from all of us to ensure that we can deliver a livable planet by 2050.
Yeah. And just to very quickly pick up on that, this is a really good example of how we are moving towards implementation. And yeah, and that works really well outside of the UNFCCC process. I think those clubs and these initiatives are really important in moving forward implementation and showing also what's possible and demonstrating that, yes, ambition can be ramped up. But how to translate that then into the UNFCCC context where there is such a desire to keep on negotiating?
But you know, the easy answer there might be, do we have to? Because if action is ongoing elsewhere, you know, I mean, I realize this sounds naive, and wishful thinking, but the UNFCCC process, like any multilateral process, is not it's not an ends in itself. I mean, it's a means to achieve something, and if we can achieve that through working through other channels, I mean, I think that we should be happy with that as well. Obviously, I mean, but we have, you know, there might come a point in time where we're saying that the Paris Agreement needs to be revamped in some way. I would think, you know, some are saying that it doesn't have teeth enough. You know, we need more sanctions. If we would have sanctions, we wouldn't have the Paris Agreement. Not in this present form anyway. So I think we've set ourselves a global rule book in terms of what we want to achieve. And additionally, my sense at least is that since Paris, that rule book has in a way evolved from, you know, just looking at the temperature goal where we set 2 degrees in Paris. My sense is that we are aiming at 1.5. You know, we all realize that we need to limit to 1.5. It's not, you know, very few countries, if any, would actually speak about 2 degrees these days. So in that sense, there has been an evolution within the process and also sort of outside the process. If we, through these various types of climate clubs and various types of initiatives or working bilaterally with countries, can achieve that, I think that's a good thing.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And, you know, in a way, this also speaks to trying to move the UNFCCC process more towards what the Montreal Protocol process is right now. We have a relatively, relatively small meeting. You still need to track whether progress is indeed being made and whether new opportunities to reduce emissions are coming up that need to be incorporated into the framework. But yes, if much of the actual action takes place outside of the UNFCCC, that would of course be ideal. You talk about sanctions. I think that's also interesting that, going back to domestic action, civil society in the Netherlands sued the Dutch government for basically not taking its duty of care towards its citizens seriously and having climate policy that was not in line with the Paris Agreement. And I think in 3 instances they won that case, and the Dutch government did have to readjust its climate policy, strengthen its climate policy, simply because civil society was able to make the case. So even though there might not be sanctions at the global level, domestically, and I think, again, this shows the power of civil society at the domestic level, can hold governments and also companies. I did the same thing with Shell in the Netherlands. They can hold them to account. Now, of course, legal frameworks differ from country to country, but I think it's a really good example of how much of the action has to take place at the domestic level.
Yeah, important point, but I would like to have the focus on the international level
yes.
at the moment. So turning to you, Haley, we see both competition and cooperation in the climate diplomacy sphere now. So with carbon border adjustment mechanism, basically putting tax on imports to the EU, but also these just transition energy partnerships, for example, that try to help certain countries to reduce their fossil fuel use. What do you make of this recent development?
Yeah, it's a really important question. I'm aware that I'm often the person who identifies the problems in every solution that's offered, and I'm afraid I'm going to do that now as well. But I actually do think there's value in that. I remember reading a number of years ago that the US military uses a strategy of red teaming. When they're about to go into an operation, they invite people from different perspectives to identify the potential points of vulnerability, the potential problems. And at that time, I thought, well, we need kind of this green teaming. We need green teaming to invite people to identify, well, this sounds like a good solution, but what are all the possible problems that could arise? And so in that spirit, I'm going to make a couple of critical comments about some concerns that I have about that turn to climate clubs and the trade and industrial policies that are being promoted in that kind of club-like way. And I think that there is a danger that it might provoke more backlash in the global South, and I mean, we need to think much more carefully about how these clubs can be complementary with the UNFCCC and not competitive. Something that Janila said in her presentation was that they don't need to be competitive. But I think that there is a risk that they will be, partly because of limited political capacity and attention. So much energy is devoted to the UNFCCC. If that attention is then diverted elsewhere, I think it means that all of the focus becomes on mitigation. So the clubs, you mentioned, Nagame, that there is this large ecosystem of climate clubs, but actually they're all focused on mitigation. And maybe there might be some rhetorical references to the importance of just transitions, but all the focus is on mitigation. And even though it's a weakness of the UNFCCC, it's also a strength from the perspective of the Global South, this idea of the single undertaking. So in the UNFCCC, we say that nothing is agreed until everything is agreed. And for the countries of the Global South, it's been really important to ensure that we don't make agreements on mitigation until we also reach agreement on questions of finance, adaptation, and technology. And that approach of single undertaking does slow things down, but it also is the only way in which countries, poorer, more vulnerable countries, can ensure that their concerns are given some kind of attention or priority in the negotiations. So having climate clubs that are focused on mitigation, risks drawing attention away from, which is already a limited attention. I mean, and I'm not even talking about the proliferation of concerns within the UNFCCC. One of the concerns that you raised was about the broadening agenda, where suddenly so many items are being added. But I'm just talking about the core traditional concerns of the climate agenda of adaptation and finance. Basically, even if we just think of adaptation and finance, there is a risk that attention to those crucial issues will be, will fall away, will be limited or diminished by more focus on mitigation. We know, I mean, it's a reality. We've seen for decades that countries are not doing what they say they will do in terms of mitigation. And sadly, that means that adaptation just becomes increasingly urgent. And for so many years, we avoided talking about adaptation because we didn't want it to be kind of, well, countries can get out of their mitigation ambition by focusing on adaptation. I mean, now it's just the reality that we need to be having much more attention on adaptation. And that has all sorts of implications for finance. So I think that there is that risk that the climate clubs will draw attention from that. And I think there is also with the climate, with the European carbon border adjustment, I think there is a risk that will trigger kind of more public resentment in the global South. I mean, here in Argentina, I often hear from when people ask me what I do, and I mention climate change politics, and even very kind of educated people will say, well, isn't that just an agenda of the global North that want to kind of secure their own privileges in the trade system, etc. And when this carbon border adjustment mechanism it's recently come into play, there is the risk that as more attention, as we become more aware of that, as the public becomes more aware of that, and the trade impacts, then there is a risk that triggers more kind of public resentment and backlash. So to the extent that these that the European Union succeeds in creating a kind of climate club linked to its own border adjustment mechanisms, I think that does have, one positive thing is that we can see that it's increasing pressure in the United States. We see a new bill proposed by a Republican senator to propose we've seen multiple proposals for border adjustment in the United States. Nothing has come of that for several years, but maybe now that will the European mechanism will push greater action in the global North, in the United States in particular. But it also comes with that risk of creating more kind of resentment from the global South, especially when countries of the global North are not fulfilling and have never fulfilled their promises in terms of finance. And we know that this is just a question of political will. We know that over $2 trillion is spent on military spending every year. It's not a lack of finance, it's a lack of political will.
Thank you, Haley. You bring up lots of points that we also find in our research, so they're very well taken. And I have many more questions for our panel, but I think we have an excellent audience both here and online. So I would like to invite questions and comments from the audience, and then maybe if Gunilla, Björn-Ola, and Alexandra also come up, if there are any questions directed at you. So would anyone like to ask the first question? Björn-Ola.
No, take someone.
Did you have a question?
Okay.
Hi, everyone. I'm Niklas Bremer from Stockholm University. I'm also a researcher in Mr. Geopolitics. This has been an excellent seminar. I think you've provided us with lots of food for thought and new perspectives on the UNFCCC. I'd like to ask a question to maybe the kind of the three panelists that have spoken latest, because you've been so much focused on the kind of dynamics within the UNFCCC. What do you think? What would it take, you think, to kind of bring back a sense of grand bargaining, great power bargaining within the UNFCCC? I'm thinking about the kind of the two major players here that I think would, you know, that we would need to see some kind of change in terms of perhaps a better climate of goodwill within or among them. And I'm thinking about, of course, the US and China. Are you seeing anything moving when it comes to these two partners, seeing kind of you know, a greater convergence on how to achieve meaningful change within this process? And I mean, I guess because this is something what Haley was mentioning perhaps before, in the sense that, of course, we're from an outside perspective, it seems that a lot of these things that we want to achieve is going to be depending on the perspectives and interests of the Chinese Communist Party and potentially the Republican Party in the US. So there seems to be a very strong need for them to kind of come together, but there seems also to be very hard. So there would be interesting to hear your reflections on that. And to Matthias, very quickly, you mentioned Saudi Arabia as from the EU perspective as a kind of potential adversary that the EU needs to engage with in its climate diplomacy. Would you like to, or it would be interesting to hear your reflections on kind of, you know, what other 4 or 5, you know, difficult partners would you kind of add to that list that you think that we should really think about for the EU to engage with meaningfully, because there are going to be those adversaries that we need to kind of engage with from an EU climate diplomacy perspective. Thank you very much.
If I start, I mean, maybe starting with your last question first. I mean, just from a mitigation perspective, I mean, I think it's a G20 which are sort of the key countries, and some of those, notably Russia, difficult to work with at this point in time. But I mean, those would be the key countries to work with, which we are in various ways. I mean, engaging in both through the G20 itself, but also through various types of bilateral cooperations. And again, from our perspective, is sort of how do we ensure that we're highlighting the opportunities that we see? I mean, just sort of bringing again the sort of the voices from the Swedish business community and the kind of opportunities that they see in creating more competitiveness and basically ensuring that this is sort of the way to make money in the future. This is the new kind of economy that we're building. And we're seeing that happening. But I think also we're at the time in the transition to net zero where these kind of the difficulties are becoming more and more apparent for countries as well as for us as a global community, and also within countries. And we're seeing that. I mean, I think as Haley also mentioned, I mean, we're seeing that, you know, if we call it the climate backlash or, you know, but the difficulties are coming more apparent. And we will be, you know, I think the next couple of years, they will be bumpy. And there might be sort of no coming around that, but rather we just have to sort of embrace and accept that it will be bumpy. And how do we sort of ensure that we can maintain the kind of urgency and again highlighting what we're seeing as sort of how do we do this in a fashion which is sort of tailored according to countries' needs and opportunities, sort of to make this in a just way, sort of to ensure that the transition happens in a just way, where I mean. No, I think I'll leave it there for this. And maybe just sort of one point, which is just to illustrate that. I mean, when we had the conversation at COP26 on phasing down coal, and we had that again at the COP27 on phasing out fossil fuels, I mean, we have a very strong EU mandate now for COP28 to still press for that. And which is going to be very difficult. But just the fact that we're actually having that conversation, I think, is a step forward. It's not going to be, we might not resolve it at COP28, but we will be discussing it, which in itself, I think, is sort of a sign of progression. You know, you can be frustrated that we're not going to get to where we want to get, and that is not happening faster. But you know, from where I sit. We've made progress in terms of, you know, with that we're actually having that kind of conversation in the open. And so I think, you know, we should also, you know, try to also be highlighting those, I mean, that as a progress, even though it's, you know, we need to move much faster than we actually are.
Thanks. Haley, do you want to comment on it as well?
Yeah, sure. And I think I absolutely agree with what's just being said, that the next few years are going to be very bumpy. And I think, Naghmeh, you mentioned earlier the geopolitical context, and I think we absolutely need to recognize that in terms of the question that's just being asked, because it's going to be very, very difficult to to renew that grand strategy or the cooperation between the major powers around climate change in the current geopolitical context, where we have two major wars going on, which the United States has a major involvement in both of those. We're seeing increased resistance to US involvement from American voters. And that is, there is a real risk that Trump returns to power. And as these two wars continue, and as the costs that are imposed, particularly on the United States, increase, then that risk grows. I just think it's going to be increasingly hard to capture the kind of attention. I mean, we see that the COPs are seen as exciting. I think for us within the climate community, they are, but for the vast majority of voters, they're not seen as exciting at all. And I think that's going to be even harder to make that process seem relevant and relevant given the other things that are happening geopolitically, especially in terms of the war in Palestine and in the Ukraine
Thank you, Haley. Richard, do you also want to comment on it?
Yeah, just very briefly. I mean, about the bargaining within the UNFCCC, there's always been bargaining because, as Haley said, nothing is agreed until everything is agreed. So that gives opportunities to parties to, I will agree with your ideas about mitigation if you, pledge more funding, for example. I think what's interesting is the bargaining that also happens outside of the UNFCCC. I think the most famous example of that was Russia to join the Kyoto Protocol on the condition that they would have access to WTO, for example. I think that kind of bargaining now, as outside the UNFCCC, has become quite a bit more difficult. As Matthias said, Russia is a bit of a dark horse. I understand that they have said that they will not agree with any language that has to do with phasing down or phasing out. And if they are really going to be that hard on it, in the old days, you'd have outside of the spotlight some bilateral discussions taking place with Russia to see, how hard is that red line that they are putting up. I can't imagine anyone from the EU now talking to Russia about these kind of things. So if that discussion takes place, it would have to go via China. The EU-China relationship isn't quite ideal either. So there is less space for that kind of bargaining at the moment because, for the very geopolitical reasons that Haley suggested. Yeah.
Let me just add sort of on the grand bargain. I mean, we just had an example of the US and China meeting, which I think concluded on Wednesday. And then those news of China coming forward with a methane action plan. No dates set for their reductions, but still, I mean, I would see that as a result of that kind of conversations. I mean, I think there are, it is a positive sign that they meet. And I mean, we saw that happening in Glasgow as well, with the kind of statement that they put forward, which I think led us to the kind of results we had there. So hopefully that also puts us in a position for COP28 to get results as well.
Excellent. So some progress. I think we have time for one last question. And unless someone points their hand up, I will give the mic to Bjørn-Ole. Yes.
Thank you. And sorry, I think we are all waiting to sort of the next step. But my name is Maria van Berlekom, and I'm heading the Unit for Global Cooperation on Environment at CEDA. So we work a lot with global actors on also climate issues. So a bit of questions, a bit of reflections. To start with, I mean, on the question or issue of clubs, I think all the examples were related to mitigation. Would the picture look different if you also included the adaptation interest, which I would presume would have a much stronger southern interest in it, just to get sort of the dynamics in that one. Also perhaps a separate question, but perhaps linked. How do you see, and that's sort of a general question to the panel and the presenters, the recently conducted Africa Climate Summit that took place in September, where actually Kenya and the African countries stepped up quite a lot and not only talked about adaptation, but also made quite strong language and commitments on green and just transition. So, how would you view that as opportunities with a sort of southern-based, attempt to leadership? Would that sort of play into the geopolitics as well? Second set of questions, more practical. I mean, in the interviews related to the sort of appetite, interest in reforms, could you see any patterns related to answers in relation to north-south and in relation to different stakeholder groups? Because you just presented now as an aggregate picture, so could you sort of discern if there were sort of any differences in what people presented? Thirdly, more a reflection from an implementation point of view, which is where sort of SIDA comes into this. I think we quite clearly don't see UNFCCC as a strong implementer per se. I mean, we do see all the other actors, having much more benefit in doing that. And I mean, just to sort of confirm, Haley and Richard, what you sort of, I think, is saying is that there might be the case that all these sort of new sub-programs, work programs, on one hand, is a result of the sort of dynamism within the convention choreography itself that sort of creates, a reason to continue negotiating. But also, if I got you right, implicitly, partly a way to sort of distract a bit, implicitly, explicitly, from the key issue about the sort of accountability sanctions. How do we really sort of get it right? I just want to sort of confirm, is that what you actually meant? And then finally, I know perhaps it's a bit political, but if you are into these clubs, whether it's mitigation, adaptation, and in the negotiation, does it matter a lot on the credibility practically when it comes to implementation? If your engagement in those, does it matter, the credibility you have on your own domestic side on living up to commitments or not? That you have a sort of strong action to match what you are saying that you want to do in these different clubs. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that excellent set of comments. And in the interest of time, I will distribute the comments. So you get the adaptation question, please.
Yes, and of course the question whether or not I was saying whether or not it was a distraction. I didn't use those words, but I don't disagree with you. Adaptation. I've been wondering what climate clubs would be in the context of adaptation. There is, for example, a NAP global network, National Adaptation Plan Global Network, which a number of bilateral donors are involved with in implementing national adaptation plans and also supporting the formulation of national adaptation plans in developing countries. And I think that sort of corresponds quite nicely with what could be a climate club for adaptation. I mean, I don't know exactly what the criteria are that you used in defining climate clubs, but I could see that as a climate club for adaptation. I think the risk is the moment you start talking about adaptation, you start talking about finance. And that makes it very difficult to sort of create a sense of coherence within a club. But I think the NAP Global Network is a good example of how countries can work together in implementing adaptation. Another example that is emerging is a partnership around transboundary or cross-border climate risks, adaptation without borders, which is sort of interestingly overlooked, or has been overlooked for a long time, because adaptation tended to focus very much on the kind of risks that happen within a country, and that's where the NAPs are built around. But countries are also affected by what happens in other countries, for example, through food trade. If an exporting country is affected by climate change and therefore can't export or bans its export for its domestic use, then other countries are going to be affected by that, and there are many examples of that. Does that mean that countries need to work together more in order to reduce the risk of these transboundary effects? That could also turn into something like a climate club, I think.
Super, thank you. So on your second question on reform dynamics, our sense from the interviews, but I would like also to hear your view, was that there's a sense from both developed and developing countries that reform is needed, but it's the details that can't be agreed on, exactly for the reasons you said, that actors don't know what to expect from the reforms. But please.
No, I would agree. I mean, and I mean, as I think we discussed briefly earlier, it's various types of interests within the process from different types of perspectives, and sometimes they sort of converge in what they don't want to achieve, even if they do it from different types of perspectives and backgrounds.
Excellent. And do you want to comment on any of the other?
Yeah, I'm so glad you raised also the Africa Climate Summit, because I think that's also one example I thought of in terms of leadership. And I mean, again, when we're speaking about what each country needs to do, it comes down to leadership, and at so many different levels, from the top level to, down to our levels, and whatever kind of roles and capacities we have, what can we do in our respective roles to make sure that we're doing more, because we will need to do more. And I think that was really an excellent example of how a sort of a head of state and government introduced this concept of this summit, and gathering and rallying the African countries around the concept of climate change as an opportunity, and not only sort of sitting back and saying, well, sitting back is the wrong word, but sort of having the conversation about finance, which it often is when we have that conversation with developing countries. And of course, it is about finance, and the Africa Climate Summit was very much about finance, but from the perspective of how do we attract investment. And I think that's sort of for us, that is really, that changed sort of the dynamics that brings to the conversation, highlights, for us at least, such a pathway which I think we all can join into, and looking then into what are the barriers for those kind of investments. And that is really what we hope to be sort of, that kind of approach we hope to be, something which we can work on globally as well.
Great. Nice to hear about the productive developments. Haley, you get the final word.
Okay, great. Thanks very much. I think it's so important to think about how we can somehow link the climate clubs with the question of adaptation, but I have no idea what that would look like. The theory of clubs and climate clubs is based on the idea that climate change is a collective action problem, and that somehow we need to avoid free riding. So we need to secure benefits, limit the benefits to the members of that club, and exclude those benefits from non-members, and that punish the people that aren't that aren't members. Now, adaptation is not a collective action problem at all. It doesn't, whether one country adapts or not, has no bearing on, well, I don't know, I've never thought about it in that way. Maybe we could stretch our imaginations to think about it as a collective action problem, but generally, whether one country adapts or not is not going to have a strong impact on another country's capacity to adapt. So given that logic of collective action and avoiding free riding, I don't know how we can squeeze adaptation into that. But I certainly think it's a challenge that we should think about. If climate clubs are going to, mitigation-based clubs are going to become, a more dominant way of approaching this challenge, then somehow linking that to questions of adaptation and finance, I think is going to be really, really important. Oh, and also finally, just quickly to clarify, whether it's a distraction, the accountability mechanisms, I think so much of what goes on in the UNFCCC is kind of a bit of a performance. The actors need to be seen to be doing something, and so this is what's politically feasible, and so, well, that's what we do.
And on that note, I would like to thank the panel very much for these engaging discussions. They were great. And also, I would like to thank all the speakers and the audience for joining us today. And a big thank you also to Jennifer, Ella, Malin, Maria, and Ylva, who have helped us set up this great seminar. So thank you very much and have a nice day.
Thank you.